Hey there, everyone. Very excited about this. We're going to be talking about how you build, how you deploy, and how you manage AI agents at scale. And this is very interesting because I think right now there's kind of like a race to the bottom to kind of like create agents, but getting into production is a whole different deal. So I'm very excited about that one. Let me start by quickly introducing myself. My name is Joe Mora, and I'm the CEO and founder of CrewAI. Very excited to be involved with Snowflake, a good partner, and to kind of like making sure to spread the gospel and agents a little bit. It's going to be a very exciting talk. We're going to get our hands dirty and actually build something. So make sure to bear with me for a second there. I do want to talk a little bit about this idea concept to production, though, and I'm going to talk about this in a few different ways. But I feel like the concepts of agents are very easy to grasp nowadays. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in a second. But then the gap between that and the prototype is somewhat big, but the gap between that and production is even bigger. There is a lot of things in there. Some of those things are not even AI related, but they can have a huge impact on how you actually decide on how you're going to build it, what you're going to build, and most important, how you're going to actually bring this and turn this into value. Now, if you keep going into this, I just want to make sure that we talk about what actually is AI agents. Well, AI agents, you all know LLMs by now. It's very good at creating content, right? If you ask them to write an email for you, they will do it. And then if you ask them to actually make that email funny, well, they will try. At least they will give it a try. But the cool thing is you can also send these models and these LLMs two different versions of the email and ask the LLM to choose what is better and why. And that's where things become interesting because these LLMs can actually choose one of the two versions and tell you why that version is actually better. And it's interesting because that's why, that's what we're calling like this reasoning like approach, because they can actually make reasonable choices. They can actually have cognition in a way to choose, well, this is actually a better option. And most people would agree that that is somewhat reasonable that they pick that one. Now, if you forget about emails and you actually think about giving this model a broader go, something more challenging that they need to do, and you give them tools, and now the LLM is not choosing what email is better, but is choosing, in order to achieve that goal, what it needs to do. And maybe it needs to pull information out of your ERP, maybe needs to push data into your CRM, whatever it might be, these models can choose. So in the end of the day, agents for me go back into one single word, and that is agency. And that means that the AI is actually controlling the application flow and deciding what happens next. So in more traditional automation, you're going to have the classical if this, then that. But on these agentic automations, the AI is actually deciding how to go about achieving that goal and anything unexpected that happens along the way. You might be asking yourself, why should I care about it? And a lot of the companies that really care about this, they're caring about this because of this concept of automations and automations that were just not possible before, right? So either because they would be very brutal or because they didn't have the same features of what you can actually do now with these models. So a good example is this idea of an agent that is trying to do a series of things to get this goal. And they might actually go from A to B and eventually C and E. So you can see that they don't need to perform a series of necessary functions, but they can actually decide what order they want to take. And there's a few things in this that actually matter. One is the ability to have that cognition, making those choices, right? Two is the ability to real time react to anything that you throw at them. So for example, if this agent, like you send like a different data to them, they're going to be able to crack that. And if step B now is not working, they might be able to work around that. And that's where we start to tap into this idea of self-healing, where now these agents can actually like work around the issues that they have in their runtime. And also this idea of self-improving, where these agents learn the pathways that work best for certain conditions, and they just start to getting better over time. Just building these agents is not enough, right? It's all about the systems that are actually reliable. And reliability, when you're actually thinking about AI agents or agentic systems in general, it can be somewhat tricky because it's not only about guardrails, but also about governance and a bunch of other things in between. Now, we have noticed that certain use cases will benefit more from agency to the point that you might want to go into one end of the spectrum and build crews. And crews is what CrewAI is known for, is this group of agents working together in order to accomplish a goal. Now, other use cases might require more determinism, where you want to control what happens in what order. So for those, you want to have a very thin layer for you to actually do some coding around what happens when. And then at some point, you might opt in on how much agency you want, to the point that you want to bring maybe one single LLM, or you want to bring one single agent, or you might want to bring an entire crew just to do that one single step. Now, those are different ends of the spectrum, but we are seeing a lot of success on getting them intertwined a little bit, where you actually can have like this deterministic kind of like structure and backbone, but then you're adding these pockets of agency depending on what is happening on the actual use case. Now, let's talk about an example of that, just to highlight how that can be useful. Let's say that we have a user, and this is going to be an agentic system that it's conversational. So they will start by engaging into this conversation with the system. And the first thing that happens is we need to understand what is that first message about. We need to process that message, decide what we want to do with that. So that is one single LLM call. You don't need an agent to do that. All you got to do is like, let's do one call and understand if this is a simple message that I can just give an answer, or is this a more complex message that might require me to do deep research, for example? Well, if this is a simple message, you can just answer right away, and that goes back into the chat, and the user can send another message. Now, let's say that this user is asking something very complex, right? So this could be, for example, a CFO asking an information about their company's revenue. Or this could be a more simple, deep research use case where they're asking something about how to fine-tune LLMs. Well, that can trigger an analysis process that behind the scenes is an entire crew of agents. And that crew will do the research, querying databases, analyzing, putting together reports, and eventually bring all that back into an answer as well. So here you can see an example of what I'm describing, where you might want to have like a more deterministic backbone, but you want to optimize for agency within some pockets of that. Now, we are seeing that a more traditional software development and a traditional software development lifecycle is very strong typed, right? There's data coming in, there's very clear transformations, and there's data coming out, and you understand what is happening there very clear. But when we're talking about agentic systems, is a little different, right? It's unclear what is data coming in. The models are black box, and the data output is also unexpected. You don't know exactly what is going to come out. And that actually changes a lot on the process of developing and building the systems, where in software, you can do a lot of like TDD or BDD, where you're actually writing tasks before you actually write the functions. And there's a lot of different ways that you can go about that. While in agentic systems, the things are a little bit different, because how you test that system that is non-deterministic. And if you start caching those requests to the models, then what are you really testing? So there's a few differences in there that we find very relevant and that we have been working with some of these companies on. And it's very exciting, from building evaluation sets to make sure that you're comparing many models. And we have features around that with CrewAI testing and CrewAI training. We're going to talk about them later today. Now, when you're thinking about optimizing these agents, right, and how you make them work better, especially when you're thinking about the agents aspect, what you see is that all these agents, they're connected with an LLM behind the scenes, and they're going to be sending requests in and receiving requests back. And the main thing that defines how good of a message you get back, how much value you extract from every single API call that you do, is actually this concept of context engineering. That basically means that you're optimizing everything about the request, not only the prompting, but the system prompt, the instructions, like the role playing, the history chat, the tools that you're sending. Everything is being optimized on the request level, so you get the most out of this LLM on every request that you do. And that will make any times over for all your agents. And that is something that CrewAI takes care for you. It allows you to change everything if you want to. You can change system prompts, you can change instructions, you can change all that, but it gives you the framework to just get things up and running extremely fast. Now, there are a few things that it uses behind the scenes to make that better. Things like memory, guardrails, training, prompting, all those things are embedded into CrewAI in a way that kind of like helps you get there. So you really want to start to thinking, even if you're not using Crew, you're using anything out there, you want to start to thinking about how you're using memory and guardrails and training and the actual prompting to actually give you the best output and to play a meaningful role on your context engineering approach. Now, for CrewAI, we work on two different main things. There's agents and tasks. There's more stuff behind the scenes, and there's a few things that you got to use once that you actually get more advanced on building these agents. But those are the two main concepts that we're going to be working with. This idea that I have an agent that is basically role-playing as someone, and I have a task that, or a series of tasks that this agent is going to be able to do. So for an agent, you have a role, you have a goal, and you have a backstory. And for a task, you have a description and you have an expected output. And are those things that you defined for agents and tasks that actually play a role on the context engineering, that define all these prompts, that define the clear instructions, the tools, and everything that comes with that. So just an important thing before we get our hands dirty. Now, a lot of people ask about, well, why would I use Crew? What is the difference between Crew and all the different options? And I do like to call this out because it's interesting that AI agents as an industry, it seems there is a race at the bottom to reduce friction to build agents. So from going from learning into prototyping, there's so many options in there, right? You have different frameworks on the open source side, you have different products, there's different ways that you can think about those. But as soon as you go from prototyping into, all right, I need to get this in production now and up and running, then values start to diminish very abruptly. And you really you start to find an uphill battle to make sure that you check all the boxes of things that you need to actually get those things live and you start to get a value from that. So it's interesting that there's a bunch of these blockers, and we hear those when customers ask all sorts of questions like, oh, can I do PII and privacy sanitization? Can I have a dedicated IP for these agents? Can I make sure that I'm using A2A and MCP because there's other parts of the business that already have some servers available? And all those things are really important for them because allow them to actually extract value. So it seems that most people, they get into the prototype staging very quickly, but they get stuck there. But everyone wants to get into the actual production, and that's where they want to get extremely fast if they want to. So if you think about this, like there's DevOps that basically helps make software deployable, right? Like they help materialize the value of building that software. You have other things like data ops, right? Another operational kind of like vertical where it helps to clean up the data, make sure that it's nice and formatted and it's ready to be available and used. And it's almost like we're missing this agentic ops piece where you need to make these agents adaptable, reliable, and deployable. And that's what we focus on in CrewAI. I mean, we have our open source offering that helps you learn, build, and prototype. And then we have our AMP, or agent management platform, that allows you to actually get these things up and running, where you have a bunch of features for free, like traces and monitoring and all that, but also deployment and training and monitoring and everything that comes in between. Now, there is this idea that there's a new stack coming together for building these agents, right? And this stack comes from the data management layer all the way to agentic apps. And in the data management, you might have things like Snowflake in there, and you're going to work your way through the different LLMs and the orchestrations and observability in order to get to like this final value. And we're noticing that independently of kind of like what customers choose on their stack, there's few things that they really care about. Interoperability being a huge one, right? They want to make sure that whatever they choose play nicely with everything else. Then governance, this idea of like, hey, my data is protected, or I'm deploying this in a way that I can actually trust that's going to work. Then this idea of evaluations to make sure that these things are doing the right thing. And then this idea of guardrails, where you want to make sure that you're kind of like allowing people, technical and non-technical, to build things, but into a certain sandbox, right? So how do you start building? Well, with CrewAI, you have two ways. You can do pro code, and that's how we have been doing most of our agents from the get-go. But more recently, we also launched a no-code way of building them, especially for technical and non-technical people. Like there's a lot of different flavors in there. But the idea is no code allows you to get extremely fast and build something extremely fast. And the pro code allows you to add any controls that you need and modify it even further. So let's build, and we're going to start actually building with the no code and then export that into code so that we can actually keep that going. So if you want to build with no code, all you got to do is you can go into app.crewai.com and you can actually create an account for free, and you're going to get access to AMP, the agent management platform. In here, you can go into Crew Studio, and that allows you to basically build these agents in a few different ways. So for example, if I open it up in here, I can do drag and drop where I'm dragging agents, I'm dragging tasks, I'm dragging integrations, and now that just works. But I usually like better to just chat my way into an automation. So I can actually come in here on this chat UI on the left and just type it out. So let's build one of those deep research examples that we mentioned, right? So let's say that given a specific topic, I want agents to do a deep research, understand all the different pros and cons and the different, let me make sure that I don't make too many typos there, and the different angles into this topic, trying to give me an unfiltered view about it, and then craft a final report for me to fully grasp the topic itself. Again, kind of like a simple use case, but just something to get us going. Now, the interesting thing in here that this is a great use case of agents and CrewAI itself, because what is actually building your agents for you now is agents. We actually have a CrewAI flow with agents that are basically taking on your prompts and breaking it down and looking at your tools, looking at your private agents, your private tools that you might have in your account, and basically building the whole thing out for you. So we can see here an academic research, a critical analyst, an industrial market analyst, and a cohesive report synthesizer. And it gave all these agents different tools, the ability to search Google, to scrape websites, the ability to like check papers, and it's doing all these things for us, and now creating the actual tasks. So what is the task that all these agents are going to do? And we can untangle that in a second to see what that actually looks like. And you can tag along the actual execution, the thought process, how it's coming around actually building these things. But let me actually untangle this for us. So if I actually untangle this, we can see the use case. There is the first academic research, there's the critical perspective, and then there's the industry impact. And you can see that those are all independent from each other, but then they all funnel into this final kind of like report. Well, if they're independent from each other, I can actually flag them to be asynchronous, because we can have all those things run in parallel and just having the final task actually wait for that. So here you can see how you can do that extremely simple and easily. Now, you can change a lot in here, right? Especially if you want somewhat technical and you want to go beyond this, you can actually click on this and changing your agents, changing the goals, changing the backstories, changing the roles, change the tools, change the agent settings, the LLM settings, enabling reasoning, delegation. There's just a lot, or even enforcing a specific format. Same way on the task side, there's a lot you can do in there. You can change the response format. You can create a guardrail. There's a lot going on. Meanwhile, I'm just going to click on run, and I'm going to enter a topic here, and I'm going to say fine-tuning small language models. And I'm just going to go, and I can see the tasks all in here, but I can go click on execute. Now, one thing that I want to call out, a lot of people like to stick around the screen because it shows you the agents, but there's not a lot of value that you can take here on execution, because what you actually want to see is the logs. So if you go into the execution tabs, you have all the traces where you can see the individual LLM calls, you can see all the messages, the system prompts, the user prompts, the raw data in case you want to trace it back or replicate requests. You get access to all of that. You can see the searches that it's doing in Google. You can see the websites that it's scraping. You can see the content that it's reading and all the information that it's doing for all our three tasks in parallel. You can see downloading papers, finding papers, reading some of this paper's content. So there's a lot going on in there. All right, so now the entire execution is done, and you can actually open the final report and you can see the entire thing. So the table of contents, you can actually go into the introduction, current industry, market size, a bunch of information in there that we can actually use. And you can change things. You can make it better and replay specific steps or replay starting here. And even on the chat, it actually gives you the option to improve the automation itself, where it's going to automatically look at the final output and update the things. Now, you can actually download this. And what you get is the actual code using CrewAI open source. And now you can build a flow around it. We can make it even better. You can add custom tools. There's so much that you can do in there. So we can actually do that right away and actually see what that code looks like. All right, so if you actually look at this folder here that I just downloaded, I'm going to zoom in a little bit so we get to see it better. You actually, there's knowledge, there's a project, it's an entire project right in there. If I look into SRC, I actually can look at my actual crew. I can see that I have config files. My config files have all my agents configuration as YAML files and tasks as YAML files, and then the actual code for crew in here. So there's a lot that we can do in there with your agents, and you can get very technical. And by then, like, you go back into regular coding where you can create these agents in here and look at the actual code. So that is very exciting. Again, unfortunately, I won't have the time to get very technical into the building and the coding piece, but this kind of highlights a little bit of what you can do with Crew and some of like the traces that you get on the platform on top of everything that you have on the open source. And with open source, the sky's the limit. You can go as technical as you want and build a lot in there. I really appreciate the time and the opportunity to talk with you all about CrewAI and some of the things that we have like been building internally. We're very excited about this. And hopefully I got the chance to dive more technically on maybe a future meeting where, sorry, a future recording where we're actually going to now get our hands dirty in the code piece as well. But I do want to highlight there's so many different ways to build these agents and to actually being able to build trust on them before you actually deploy them. Thank you so much. And I hope you have an amazing day. I'll catch you later. Bye-bye.